Welcome back to the Shaw Consulting Social Housing Technology Podcast. In our previous episode, Cyber Assurance and Resilience, we explored how cyber has moved firmly onto the boardroom agenda and why it is now a core part of organisational resilience. In this episode, we're building on that conversation and focusing on what cyber resilience really means in practice for social housing organisations, from risk and regulation through to culture and communication. I'm your host, Stuart, and today I'm joined by Shaw Consulting's Associate Director of Cyber Assurance, Ian Whitwell. Hi, Ian. Welcome back.
Hi, Stuart.
So, in the last episode, we talked about cyber as a board-level issue. Bringing it back to social housing specifically, why is this sector particularly exposed to cyber risk?
Well, Stuart, I think the assumption used to be that as a not-for-profit providing a social service to the sector, it wouldn't be targeted, as opposed to the obvious targets such as finance and commercial sectors. However, there's no morals in cybercrime. And obviously, you've got things like bots and agents used to identify vulnerabilities in an organisation's cybersecurity and then exploit those weaknesses. And certainly, coming from the private sector into housing 16 years ago, I could see that cyber security in the sector was lagging the private sector standard. And as a consequence, I've spent a lot of time over the past 16 years ensuring that I implemented the best cybersecurity practices in my organisation and promoting this to my peer group within the housing sector.
I think what you're saying there, everything is on the table when it comes to these criminals and cybercrime.
Absolutely. There's no morals in cybercrime.
So how does cyber resilience link to the expectations of the regulator of social housing, particularly around governance and viability?
Well, I think a successful cyber attack can lead to the downgrade of both governance and viability ratings, obviously depending on the severity and length of time to recover from the attack. I think as well, it could potentially impact the new customer standard rating in certain circumstances. And obviously, the worst case scenario, you could even have an organisation placed into special measures.
So it's critical. I think that's fair to say, isn't it, from what you've just said?
Absolutely.
So where do you see cyber risk sitting alongside things like tenant safety and compliance? Is it being given the same level of attention, do you think?
Well, I certainly was in my previous role at Muir Group as Assistant Director of Business Transformation and Technology. I was personally responsible for managing the corporate cybersecurity risk, and that risk was the highest rating on the register in terms of likelihood, impact, and adverse risk appetite, even higher than the compliance risk on the corporate register.
Wow.
Over recent years as well, as our board and exec became increasingly aware of the impact of cyber attacks that had occurred in the sector and in the public domain, they rightly expected me to provide a high level of assurance and strong evidence as to our risk management approach.
So you were very well prepared in your previous role. But just say, let's look at the wider sector. You said before that organisations need to move away from thinking if to when it comes to cyber attacks. So what does this mindset shift actually look like in practice for a housing association?
I think it's got to be a culture shift at all levels. And as any successful implementation of change of culture, it needs to start from the top. Certainly the board and leadership team need to communicate the importance of cybersecurity to all areas of the business, and together with expecting a clear strategy and regular updates from the team responsible for cybersecurity.
Okay, so what changes when a leadership team genuinely starts planning on that basis rather than treating cyber as just a remote risk? What are the changes that are needed?
Well, I just said it. I think culture shift is the key. And I think this needs to be demonstrated by the preparation of a clear and robust cyber incident response plan, and that to be integrated with the business continuity plan. I think that all areas of the business need to understand the potential impact of a cyber attack on their business as usual operations. And importantly, have a robust plan in place to continue that business as usual for the short and medium term. Obviously, with any plan, you need to test that plan on a regular basis. And I would advise both as a desktop test and potential real life simulations. And I think as well, openness and saying that the results of each test needs to be communicated to obviously the board and exec, but the wider business too, with a clear improvement plan where necessary.
I guess as part of putting all these things in place, communications is pretty important. So say when an attack happens, particularly in social housing where tenant trust is critical, what does good communications look like in these circumstances?
Well, I think honesty is the key with all stakeholders. And for that, I mean internal and external. I think comms needs to be appropriate, not too detailed. And it's important to keep providing regular updates, even if there's no significant change in the situation. Certainly don't leave a comms blank hole. If you do, then you'll just get the rumour mill taking over. I think as well to provide reassurance where possible and certainly spell out the options for normal operations. Can I still get my repair done? Can I pay my rent? And I think a novel approach as well would be to consider video comms via appropriate channels from one of the higher execs or chief exec even, and that to be done at regular intervals. Because I think seeing an appropriate human face is an important reassurance that the situation is under control.
Okay, thanks for that, Ian. So just moving this on a little bit. So who should be responsible for communications during an incident? And how important is it this is actually planned in advance?
So I think importance needs to be at the exec level, chief exec really, together with a comms manager. And I think different messages are required for different groups of stakeholders. I think relevant execs could also be responsible for getting specific messages out to their area of responsibility. For example, if there's going to be a problem paying suppliers, then maybe the finance exec takes the lead in that communication. And I think as well, with anything, it's a good idea to have a number of pre-prepared comm scripts for typical scenarios so that you can tailor these to the specific situation when required, rather than trying to write that comms from scratch in what will be a very precious situation. And probably as well, have a holding message that you can put out quickly if you have actually got a cyber incident taking place.
So it sounds like you were pretty well prepared in your previous role in social housing, but how prepared are organisations typically when it comes to having clear, usable communications plans and the messaging ready?
I think it's a very mixed bag, really. And if I'm honest, I suspect not many. I think messages are often confusing, lack real information, and even worse, sometimes can be completely misleading. The danger is that organisations are trying to hide the problem from their customers and staff with a nothing to see here approach, which is not what you should be doing.
Clearly not appropriate. So you've picked up on the tenant, the customer. From their perspective, what does a cyber incident actually feel like, and how should that shape the way the organisations communicate?
Yeah, I think you need to put yourself in the mind of your tenant really, think about it from the tenant's perspective. Can I contact the organisation using the normal channels, phone, social media app, etc.? How do I pay my rent? Importantly, has my personal data been compromised? I mean, these are questions the organisation should look to cover off before they're asked.
So trust and transparency, really. So how important is that trust and transparency with tenants during and after such an incident?
I think it goes back to that openness thing. I mean, really, trust, as anybody knows, is very hard to gain and very easy to lose. Being open and honest is the best way forward. Absolutely, don't overpromise when it comes to timescales to restore impacted services to business as usual, normal operation. And you could even argue that it might be possible to see the positive in a way, seeing it as a wake-up call and improve services. For example, if you're replacing poor legacy services that have potentially been open to compromise by the cyber attack with new secure ones.
I think we've all seen that overpromise in terms of timescales with some of the high-profile cyber
God, yeah.
incidents, haven't we, in the last 12 months?
Yeah.
So just moving away from communications, you've already sort of touched on this culture and probably in culture and shared responsibility. So you talked about cybersecurity being everyone's responsibility, not just the IT team. In reality, how well is that understood across organisations?
Talking to my peers in other associations over the last few years, not very. Cybersecurity is still often seen as very much an IT responsibility. Although I think with these high profile attacks in the public domain, that attitude is beginning to change as board and exec realise it's their responsibility.
Well, what does a strong cyber culture actually look like in a social housing organisation?
I think you need to see evidence of staff at all levels of the organisation actively promoting awareness of cybersecurity, and that this is a regular topic of conversation. It's key that you address instances of poor cyber behaviour as a management issue and provide support and guidance where necessary.
How do you move from policies and training to something that genuinely influences sort of day-to-day behaviour?
I think, I've mentioned previously, it's got to be a real topic of conversation, particularly via internal messaging and staff briefings and any of those regular get togethers at the team level or at the organisational level. For example, publishing regular updates on cyber training and testing results, spotlighting the good and not so good examples of cyber awareness and action. And, even consider what I call gamification of phishing tests to add that sort of competitive edge across teams in the organisation. You could even think about maybe a small team prize for the best team in spotting the phishing tests and reporting them correctly.
That's a really interesting final point you made there, Ian. Just let's bring in leadership as well on this. What role do leadership behaviours play in setting that culture? And what can sometimes undermine it without organisations, say, actually realising?
Well, I think it's a say and do situation with leadership, and they need to be taking that cybersecurity seriously and be seen to be doing that. I've touched on previously, active promoting examples of good cybersecurity and addressing incidents of failure. For example, if a staff member has reported a potential issue, ensuring that a proper response has been given and not just ignored. You need to be sure that you're asking the right questions about cybersecurity. And, if you don't, that can potentially undermine what might look like a good cybersecurity from above. The need of, the exec and the board to continually question those responsible for cybersecurity and receive appropriate assurances that those measures can be verified.
So it's a constant, really, isn't it? It's not something that a form's filled in or a report's done and it's put on a shelf.
Exactly. It's not just a once in every 6 months. It's got to be a regular heartbeat.
So what behaviours, say, can unintentionally weaken a cyber-aware culture?
I think that complacency, really. The reality is 100% that cyber security and cyber attacks are becoming increasingly sophisticated. And there's no such thing as standing still in cybersecurity. You're either moving backwards or forwards. For example, there was a very interesting recent news story regarding artificial intelligence becoming increasingly used for cyber attacks. State actors and cyber criminals both are finding new vulnerabilities and exploiting these vulnerabilities.
Okay, thanks, Ian. So just moving away from the culture side of things, let's just take a quick look at assurance and accountability. So there's a lot of focus on assurance at board level. From your experience, how well do organisations really understand what good cyber assurance looks like?
Well, I think the problem is really that board expertise traditionally has been focused on customers, assets, and finance, which can mean that knowledge of IT and cyber areas is limited, perhaps devolved to someone who's not really experienced in that area. So I think it's very important to have a board member with strong cyber background and make sure that that member then can then ask the right assurance questions and understand the responses, what's good and maybe not so good.
And for the frontline teams, housing officers and operational staff, what role do they play in providing that assurance?
Well, I think from my own experience, human error is one of the biggest risks in cybersecurity. It's vital to ensure staff are well trained in best practice, how to spot a cyber incident and how to quickly report it. That's really essential. You need regular testing and reporting of staff cyber awareness and providing assurance that the organisation is cyber aware and that poor results are acted upon if measurable targets are not being met.
And what should boards actually be seeing in terms of reporting to give them real confidence rather than just that high level reassurance?
It's difficult, you're looking at a technical area for a board, but I think reporting should focus on what I regard as the key areas of cybersecurity. And I say those are people and processes, technology, and assurance and governance. So in each of those areas, a clear narrative should be used, and obviously not technical jargon, to describe what cybersecurity is in place, how effective it is, and what improvements are planned for the next reporting period. And then once you've got that, the board can then review each new period, contrasting it with the previous period. Have the actions that have been identified taken place? Have there any issues occurred in the last period? That sort of thing.
And you've just touched on this just to finish off. And, how do you avoid reporting becoming too technical or at the other extreme, too high level to be of any use?
It is difficult. It's a balancing act. And hopefully, the board do have the expertise to understand perhaps some of the more technical areas relating to cybersecurity without becoming heavily jargon led. And conversely, the person responsible for providing the reporting understands the knowledge of the audience and absolutely uses non-technical jargons, i.e. plain English.
Ian, thanks again for your time. In the next episode, we'll be focusing on what happens when a cyber incident hits, from business continuity and decision making under pressure through to learning lessons and strengthening resilience. As always, if you'd like to find out more about Shaw Consulting Cyber Assurance Service, you can contact Chris Shaw or Ian via LinkedIn. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.